Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of The American Founding, a podcast about early American history, political philosophy, and the United States Constitution. The American Founding is sponsored by Grove City College here in Western Pennsylvania. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Grove City College. It ranks among the best colleges and universities in both Pennsylvania and the United States. It fosters intellectual, moral, spiritual, and social development consistent with a commitment to Christian truth and a Christian worldview. It advocates individual freedom and personal responsibility and seeks to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. It's also one of the few truly independent colleges in the United States of America. It accepts no federal funding, including federal student aid, which allows the college to operate free of government interference or political influence. All in all, it's a really great school, and I encourage you to go to faithandfreedom.com to learn more about both Grove City and the Institute for Faith and Freedom. All right, well, again, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. Last week, we've sort of been going through the major items within the Constitution. We've talked about the extended republic. We've talked about the Senate. We've talked about the compromise over slavery. Last week, we talked about checks and balances. And Madison in Federalist 51 calls checks and balances, he calls it an auxiliary precaution. It's not going to stop a republic from devolving into tyranny in and of itself, because ultimately all power in a republic flows from the people. And so if the people are really insistent on turning their republic into mob rule, that's going to happen. What checks and balances does, it does a couple of things. It slows down deliberation so that the public opinion becomes sort of well developed, because it has to move across multiple political institutions, the House, the Senate, the President. Also, it does a really good job of setting elites against one another. And for this idea, the framers relied very heavily on the institutions of the Roman Republic. So that was last week. This week, we're going to talk about federalism. And I have a couple questions that I want to sort of introduce here that I'm going to seek to offer an answer to. The first is, what is federalism? Second are, what are its provisions within the Constitution? Where does it exist? The third is, why does it exist? And then the fourth one, which I think will be a very interesting one, is what are the tensions or questions or contradictions surrounding federalism, because they're there. And it's in fact a major meta-narrative of the early republic up to and including the Civil War, really culminating with the 14th Amendment. You see this kind of ongoing debate about questions that essentially boil down to the scope of federalism and what does it really mean in practice. So, what is federalism? Federalism is, simply put, it's a system of power sharing within the Constitution between the states and the national government. Now, as a point of clarification right out of the gate here, oftentimes we call the national government the federal government, which is fine. It's a perfectly sort of acceptable term of art, and it goes all the way back to the original founding. The advocates of the new government were called Federalists. And one of the things I think that they were doing in picking that name is that they were emphasizing one of the aspects of the new Constitution that really appealed to those who were going to be most skeptical of a strong central authority. Calling themselves Federalists was a sort of way of, even the name was intended as a way to put potential critics at ease. But it gets very confusing in when we're talking about federalism, to call it a system of power sharing between the states and the federal government. That gets just too much federal. So what I'm going to do for the purposes of this episode is, when I'm talking about what we take to be the federal government, I'm just going to call it the national government, just because it's easier. So think about power sharing between Washington, D.C., or the national government and the state governments. Now, this power sharing exists in two distinct ways in the original Constitution. The first, and probably the most important at the time, was that states participate in federal policymaking. The second one, and still durable today, is that the states and the federal government share the power of governance. With the latter, the national government focused on national issues, at least in theory. and the former is supposed to tend to more local matters. So the idea behind this would be probably a great example of how we all experience the dynamic of federalism was with COVID. Because the national government did not have the power to, stop people from going to the grocery store. That's not really within their sphere of authority under the Constitution. But that was a power that the state governments possessed. So that's sort of an example. Another way to think about this are your traffic laws, your local police, even your state police, your state highway laws. All those things are all determined by the state governments under the Constitution, and things like foreign affairs are national affairs. Okay. So both of these two powers have specific provisions within the Constitution. They're there. There's no article in the Constitution called Federalism, or that you could subtitle Federalism. It just sort of runs through the document from the beginning until the end. So let's talk about states participating in federal policymaking. The first and the most significant way, but now no longer the case, was the Senate. Right? The state governments chose United States senators in the original Constitution. This was not changed until the 17th Amendment in 1913. And it was done so, and I know a lot of conservatives who are advocates of limited government really lament the 17th Amendment. And I will say, maybe a subject for a later episode, but it was done because the Senate had become deeply corrupt. And corruption in the Senate was a really big deal because the Senate in the constitutional schema is really, really important. The Senate is, I think I've talked about this before. If you do a Venn diagram of the three major functions of government, executive, judicial, and legislative, the place where they overlap is the Senate. The Senate has a bit of all three. It's very, very important. And so the fact that the Senate was chosen by state governments, state legislatures, gave state governments meaningful say in the construction of federal policy. Right? State governments. Now, this gets amended and it changes to popular elections. So it gives the people, the political community of the state, a meaningful say. So it's sort of changed in some sense. It's sort of changed on a federal sense in some ways, but not in others, because it's still state-centric. There is another way in which the state governments, though, are still in the mix, directly involved in federal power, and that is the process of amending the Constitution. State legislatures are tasked with ratifying changes that are proposed either by Congress or state ratifying conventions. That is a power that remains. So the only way that you can amend the Constitution is you have to get the approval of the state governments. And also, I should say, it existed at the time in the process of ratifying the Constitution in a kind of what it seems at first to be a bit of a weird way, but is really suggestive of the ambiguities inherent to federalism, is that the states ratified the Constitution, but it was not the state governments. It was the people of the states, organized and represented by ratifying conventions. The people voted for special ratifying conventions. So the states enacted the Constitution, although the state governments did not. It was the people within the states. That's going to be a theme that kind of pops up at various points in time throughout early American history, early Republican history, of understanding the role of the states. There's a difference here in the mind of the founders, certainly in James Madison, between the state governments and the people of the states. So that's the first thing. The Senate, the states participate directly in federal policymaking. Second is that the states have distinct spheres in which they operate, so that this sort of local, national jurisdiction. And this is contained in a bunch of places within the Constitution. One place that it's located is in the subtext of Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 enumerates the powers of the Congress. And the implication here, then, is that if we're listing powers, there must be limits to federal authority. And later on, this implication is made explicit in the 10th Amendment, which reserves all power not explicitly granted to Congress, either to the states or the people themselves. And by the way, that addition of the people themselves was made specifically with that kind of anxiety about the state governments in mind, right? That there's a difference between the people as constituted within states and the state governments. So the idea then would be that when the federal government hits its limits in Article 1, Section 8, that's where state authority begins. And ironically, it's sort of reinforced by Article 10. Article 10 is an article that takes a number of powers granted to the federal government and denies them to the states. So states can't make treaties, they can't grant letters of marque and reprisal, they can't coin money, they can't do things like that. And so what that means in turn then is that if Article 10 is explicitly limiting the power of the states, then things that aren't in there are presumably powers that the states possess. And you can also appreciate this because Article 10 goes further than that by prohibiting the states from enacting laws impairing the obligations of contracts. And that is going to be a tool in the early republic, particularly by the Supreme Court under the Marshall Court, to stop, check, and rebut state authority. So famously, the tussle over the Yazoo land scandal, where the state of Georgia was bribed into selling this land, and then they undid the land sales, and the Marshall Court strikes it down. That they did so under what's known as the Contracts Clause. And then ultimately, Article 10 gets a major boost by the 14th Amendment, which obliges the states to provide fair and equal treatment for citizens within its borders. We'll talk about that way on down the road. The 14th Amendment is a Civil War amendment. It is a proposal by the radical Republicans in Congress as a stipulation of the former states in secession to come back into the Union. They have to ratify this. It's an important development, but it's a later development, and it really diminishes the scope of state authority. Anyway, the point is that by 1787, then, with the Constitution in September, you get a sort of situation in which the national government clearly is defined by what it can do and what it can't. I put it this way. The national government, you get this clear definition of what it can do. And then also the state governments, you get this clear list of things that they can't do. And so the Constitution, if you remember from like high school civics, they would create a Venn diagram of the powers of the federal government. The exclusive powers are just here, and then the exclusive powers of the state are here, and the shared powers like the taxing power in the middle. That's all sort of within the Constitution, and that's really one way to understand federalism as a power-sharing arrangement. It's all kind of in there. It's this idea that the states have their own sphere, they have their own domain. Okay, so why does this exist? And federalism is very different than, say, checks and balances, or even the extended republic, where you have the framers, Madison particularly, engaging with these long-standing historical debates. This is really not the background for understanding federalism and why federalism exists. There's really no great theoretical treatise that I know of arguing for the virtues of federalism as it comes down in the United States Constitution, or even the ways in which the federal government adopted it, or the national government in the Constitution. And it's not really there. What is, though, important, and the reason to understand federalism, is not that it has any kind of grand theoretical defense, but that the states already exist. Remember that in 1787, the status quo position that the framers are trying to revise with the Constitution is state power, sweeping state power, and little central power. The states exist. They are the dominant forces within American political society. That matters. And you can actually see this at the Constitutional Convention at the very beginning. The way in which disputes were resolved within the Constitutional Convention was every state got one vote. That's a reflection of the power of the states within the political community. Right? Now, there are people who don't want this. Chief among them at the convention, I would argue, would be James Madison. Madison's Virginia plan, insofar as we would call it a federal system, it's very, very limited. Madison would only allow the states to participate marginally in the national government. They would be allowed to nominate candidates for the Senate, but they would be chosen by the by the House. Congress would have basically plenary or complete power to determine what the national interest was and to make laws consistent with that. And Madison would also give Congress the power to veto state laws. He wanted the states explicitly put into a secondary position, the contours of which, like exactly where the states would be, they would be in their own spheres, but the contours of those spheres would be determined by Congress according to its understanding of the national interest. So this is not really the states having an independent basis of power. They really don't. Congress gets to decide, at least in the Virginia plan as it comes down to us, what would be in the national interest and what wasn't. And if Congress vetoed a state law, that was it. There's no final arbiter of congressional vetoes over state legislation. Madison really, I think I talked about this a couple weeks ago, Madison wanted to put the states back in the positions of colonies. Hamilton would have done the same. We're going to talk about Hamilton more next week. A really interesting episode about Hamilton's ideas. But Hamilton sort of has the same vision of reducing them as close to administrative districts as he could. So, the vision for Hamilton is sort of almost the way counties and cities are within states today, that they only exist at the pleasure of the state. Hamilton would sort of have done the same thing to states as vis-a-vis the national government. That's not what we get, though. That's not what we get. Madison and Hamilton and their allies lose. The system that we have is a lot closer to what John Dickinson suggests. And this is a quote from Dickinson early in the convention. And I think Dickinson here offers a really, really vivid and on-the-nose analogy for thinking about federalism. He says, "Let our government be like that of the solar system. Let the general government be like the sun and the states the planets, repelled yet attractive, and the whole thing moving regularly and harmoniously in their several orbits." And I think that's a really, really important way to understand this, is that Dickinson's metaphor is working in a couple ways here. The national government, or the general government he's called, is the sun. So it's at the center. But the states are the planets, and they're all sort of having an interactive effect on one another, and they all move in their own regular ways. And they're all repelled yet attracted. And so you get this harmony. So the way Dickinson is sort of envisioning the states here is almost a kind of check on the national government is certainly one way to think about this, but also establishing these two separate tracks of governance, one being dominant over the other, but not entirely so. And there's a push and pull, and it's in that push and pull that you get a kind of constitutional harmony. Hamilton, which is ironic, kind of specifies on this in Federalist 29, where he's talking about the dangers of the what happens if the national government overruns its powers. And this is what he says: "The state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachments from the federal government, will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers, and will be ready enough, if anything improper appears, to sound the alarm to the people, and not only to be the voice, but if necessary, the arm of their discontent." That's classic Hamiltonian kind of rhetoric there, but it sort of gives a version of what would happen in the sort of Dickinsonian vision. If the federal government disrupts the harmony of the system, the state governments are there to push back. And so the states almost can kind of be like another layer of checks and balances within the system. I think that's certainly one way to view it. But also there are certain things that just properly belong within the orbit of the states. Not everything is in the orbit of the national government. And Madison, and it's important to bear in mind here, Madison, as he is arguing, in the Federalist, this is not necessarily the real voice of Madison. It's an important thing to bear in mind. And I'll talk about this more a little later on when we get to Federalist 10. But Madison is making arguments for federalism in the Federalist Papers that in private he was very opposed to. Bear that in mind, that when we think about the Federalist, is that it's written by Madison and Hamilton, and they put their own views in here, but in a lot of respects, A, they're making the case for the convention as a whole, and B, they're trying to make the argument to get the thing ratified. So there's a little, I don't want to call it cynicism, but you have to understand the Federalist Papers as a political document, at least in part. So with that in mind, this is Madison in Federalist 46. The federal and state governments are in fact but different agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. So you sort of, again, this is a kind of a specification of Dickinson's analogy of the solar system. And I think that the fact that this analogy comes from Dickinson is really the reason that it gets adopted, is because Dickinson is a small state nationalist. He wants a stronger government. He needs a stronger government. Delaware is desperately in need of a strong central government. But Delaware is not willing to sacrifice its entire political identity to a new national republic. Dickinson is not willing to do that. So what Dickinson instead is envisioning here is this sort of balance of tug and pull within a solar system analogy. And that is a very, very appealing argument to small state nationalists. I'm thinking particularly of Connecticut and also New Jersey. All of those states, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, they all overwhelmingly ratify the Constitution. So also does Maryland, even though Maryland's delegates to the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention, like Luther Martin, are strongly opposed. Maryland overwhelmingly ratifies it because of this federalism, is that it's preserving the identity and some of the power of the states while creating a national government. You also see something similar here from the slave states, particularly John Rutledge. You'll remember a couple weeks ago when we talked about the slavery issue, that it was Rutledge, in his capacity as the chairman of the Committee of Detail, who introduces the idea of enumerated powers. He gets rid of Madison's suggestion of general power, which the convention had tentatively approved, and swaps in it for enumerated power. And importantly, enumerated powers that put up a lot of barriers over what the national government can do to the southern plantation export slave economy. So you see a similar thing here. The slave interests of South Carolina and Georgia are worried about national meddling. So you have small states and slave states who are nationalistic in general, but need specific concerns addressed, that this compromise emerges. And in fact, the most nationalist positions at the convention usually come from guys like James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Rufus King of Massachusetts, James Madison of Virginia, Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. All of them are large state nationalists. Alexander Hamilton's also, frankly, a large state nationalist as well, even though the dominant position within the New York delegation is what would become anti-federalism. New York is a large state. Hamilton's a nationalist. He's a large state nationalist. These individuals are most likely to take the plunge. They have greater confidence that their local interests will be attended to because they're so big. They're not as worried about that. Now, that's not to suggest that anybody here, the large state nationalists, the small state nationalists, are being small-minded. I don't think that's it at all. I think it's rather that when you're thinking, and this just goes for anybody, when you're thinking about the big picture of the world, try to interpret and understand it in a way that doesn't come through your own personal experience. You can't do it. So a guy like John Dickinson is going to coming from Delaware, or James Patterson of New Jersey, or Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut. Their conception of statecraft is going to be read through the smallness of their state and the proximity of states that are larger. Whereas Madison and Hamilton and Morris and King and Wilson just aren't thinking about things like that, I don't think. So here's where we go. Here's where we land then. We begin the convention with the states holding effectively all of the power, or most of the power, too much power. We're not going to reduce the states to colonies. We're not going to subjugate the states to the national government through something like the congressional veto. Then the states are going to have to be placed against the national veto, against the national government. They're just going to have to be hung up next the national government. And that's what Dickinson envisions. And frankly, I don't think there was any real alternative to this, as much as Madison was disappointed. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Because there are tensions within this, like logical or even philosophical tensions. And it's interesting because this is a point on which both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists agree. The Federalism implies what Madison called imperium in imperio, or a government of governments, or a sovereignty within sovereignty. Definitionally, you could see this as a contradiction in terms. What is sovereignty in the public sense? The sovereign is the entity with a monopoly on force, with the power to direct, command, and force us to do things. It's exclusive. It has to be. All right. It has to be, at least when we're understanding the definition. Right? The state is the entity with the power to tell us to do things that we would not otherwise do. We need somebody like that, and it has to be an exclusive authority. Except that there are two sets of authorities here. So you can argue that there's a logical tension here. And I would suggest as well that in general, the Constitution dispenses with the notion that politics has to be logical in a philosophical sense, because it has many logical tensions inherent to it. I mean, look at Congress. On the one hand, Congress represents a national republic. On the other hand, it represents a confederation of states. Those are two different visions of government that really are not reconcilable with one another. So we just stuck them together. Right? And so this idea here, rather than thinking about politics as the act of reconciling contradictions, but rather an act of balancing competing visions, a political back and forth, that's what federalism is. That's what it is. But there's a lot of criticism about this, because the question, if we're sticking with Dickinson's idea of balance, there's a question about whether or not, and of course it is the question, if the goal is balance, is the Constitution going to achieve this balance? Is it going to properly balance the states against the national government? The Anti-Federalists argue very vociferously that the answer is no. This is where the Anti-Federalists really lean into the vague clauses within the Constitution, like the General Welfare Clause in Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power to raise revenue for the general welfare. What does that mean? The Necessary and Proper Clause. Pretty much every little wiggle phrase that the nationalists managed to get into the Constitution, including the preamble, "We the people of the United States," that's a very nationalist statement. Every one of those, the Anti-Federalists look at and say, aha, you see, this is not actually going to be balanced. It has the appearance of balance, but when you look at the actual distribution of power over regulation of the militia, over taxes, over the economy, even the Anti-Federalists will argue, some of them in their least persuasive, some of their least persuasive rhetoric, is the exclusive authority of Congress to control the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Their argument basically amounts to, this is effectively a camel's nose under the tent. That's what all of this is. That ultimately there's not a balance here, but what's going to happen is that everything is going to be resolved in favor of the states. And one of the reasons they argue that is because you can read, like Brutus, I think, uses the phrase imperio in imperium. Like, this doesn't make any sense. And this is exactly what Madison was arguing in private, except he was convinced of exactly the opposite. This is a letter that he wrote on September 6, 1787 to Thomas Jefferson. So you'll note Constitution Day is September 17th. So this is while the Constitution is still going on. This is him. To Jefferson. I hazard an opinion that the plan, should it be adopted, will neither effectually answer its national object nor prevent the local mischiefs which everywhere excite disgust against the state governments. In other words, Madison sort of agrees with Brutus. Oh yeah, there's not going to be a balance. Except Brutus is exactly wrong. The Anti-Federalists are exactly wrong. The real problem is going to be the state governments. because the Constitution doesn't go far enough. Madison is particularly salty about the lack of the veto over the state laws, which later on in October he called a check. It was needed as, quote, a check in the whole over the parts. And that the only way, Madison believed, the only way you're going to avoid the problems of all confederacies, which is a lack of a central authority to say this is a yes, this is a no. You need that veto. Congress got rid, didn't, or the convention didn't include it. And I would point out as well, I would note the date. This is a follow-up letter. Basically what happens is Madison writes a letter to Jefferson that boils down. He's sort of giving Jefferson the spilling the tea, as they say, about the convention. Says, I'll write more later on. Right now, I got to tell you, I don't like it. And then he writes back in October, in October, and goes into detail. And this gets to the point I mentioned earlier. There's a difference between the public Madison and the private Madison, because this is October 24th. The private Madison is either has just published or is just about to publish Federalist 10, which is the great essay of the National Republic. But the private Madison is saying, yeah, this Constitution is actually not going to create a national republic because it doesn't have the authority that's necessary. Right? So it's ironic here. I think there's a whole host of ironies. One irony is that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists actually weirdly half agree. Another irony is that the most memorable Madisonian essays are things that, at least at the time, you didn't really think. But and a final irony here is that it is that lack of conviction in the Constitution that makes him such a good polemicist in its favor. Because he thinks that the Anti-Federalists are exactly wrong. That if anything, the Constitution doesn't go far enough. So he is very well positioned, and roughly in the halfway through the Federalist Papers, through like 40, I think like 39 through like 53 are sort of his great kind of commentary on the functioning of this government, where he basically argues that if there's any side that's advantaged here, it's the states, right? So like in Federalist 45, he says, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. All right. So Madison is sort of making the point that, like, oh no, this actually, if you're the problem with this document, I mean, it doesn't come right out and say this in the Federalist Papers, but it's certainly implied. And when you read his private letters, his view comes into great detail. Oh no, the real problem with this thing is that it doesn't go far enough. There's too much ground left for the states. Right. So what both sides are worried about here is that the proper sphere of the one will encroach on the prerogatives of the other. Right. And this actually kind of fits into an issue from last week, which is judicial review evolving into judicial supremacy. Because Madison's concerned, like I said, it mentioned in a letter he writes to Jefferson in October, who is going to provide, quote, the check in the whole over the parts. Well, we get our answer during the Marshall Court, which is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to emerge as the great manager of the federal relation between the states and the national government. Madison doesn't see that coming in 1787, and the fact that Madison is so worried is really very good evidence in favor of this idea that judicial review as we have it today, which is the courts having the final say over what is constitutional, was not a view that was widely held in 1787. All right, so another tension, and I would say the more of a forward-pointing tension here that's embedded within the Federalist question is, what are we? What is the United States of America? Are we a nation of a single people, or are we a union of the states? And federalism, you can sort of see it as kind of a division of power, and you can sort of see it in those political terms, but you can also take all of those ways in which power is sometimes divided in it from a national perspective and sometimes on a state-based perspective and say, so are we a national republic, or are we a confederation of states? And we're kind of both. We talked about this with the Senate. And so you see these moments in the Constitution that are very nationalistic. Like, and I mentioned these, the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, ... do ordain and or establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That is a very nationalistic statement. But at the same time, the adoption of the Constitution happens on a state-by-state basis. That Constitution only has the force of law when 9 states agree. And changes to the Constitution, including changes to the preamble, have to be approved by state governments. So we get this weird sort of middle ground, the people acting within their capacity as the sovereign authority of each state. That's the vision, which is a very complicated one. Or at least it's a vision that's in tension here. And the Constitution holds this intention, and this ends up, and I've mentioned this, time and time again through this set, like the Constitution doesn't necessarily take these things and resolve them. In many respects, it just enshrines these unresolved questions into the Constitution itself because they didn't have a resolution to them. What are we? Are we a national one people, or are we a community of states? I don't know. Like, we really going to answer this? We need to raise taxes in 1780. We can't get hung up on these philosophical questions. So let's just kind of say that we're both. And this ends up being a major philosophical bone of contention over the course of, the period from, almost right away. The debates over the necessary and proper clause, over the question of the Bank of the United States in 1791, all the way to, the 14th Amendment. These are all questions about, like, what are we? And this ends up becoming a major philosophical bone of contention. Now, one reason for this is that it's just kind of gamesmanship. Both sides in any dispute are always desperate and eager to claim constitutional ownership, that the Constitution actually vindicates my view. So you see that happen again and again. But I'll give you some examples of this. Like, for instance, you see this in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The background of that is 1798. Congress passes the Sedition Act, which effectively criminalizes political speech against the government. Madison writes a Federalist paper that basically echoes Hamilton's call in Federalist 29, or whichever Federalist it was. I don't remember which one it was. It was Federalist, was it 29? I think it was 29. Saying, the states are going to raise the alarm. And that's sort of what Madison talks about in his Virginia resolutions. But Jefferson in the Kentucky resolutions goes farther. Jefferson in the Kentucky resolution says this law is of null, void, and of no force within Kentucky. Is that a power that Kentucky has? Does Kentucky possess that power? I mean, there's not really a dispute that Virginia can raise the alarm against inappropriate federal action, like what Madison's calling, which could be as simple as, just trying to rally the state governments and rally the people because the state governments are a big deal, right? Madison doesn't take it as far as Jefferson does. And it sort of gets down to this idea of, can states nullify laws that clearly violate the Constitution? And can they do that because they're a party to the contract, that the Constitution is a contract? This pops up again in the 1830s over the question of nullification. John C. Calhoun makes and expands upon that point. South Carolina can nullify the tariff laws because they are a violation of the proper sphere of federal authority. Andrew Jackson says, no, you can't do that because, as it says in the preamble, we are a nation, and you can't have a part nullifying the acts of the whole. In a nation, you can't do that. And then, of course, it appears as well with, the Civil War, right? The Civil War, I mean, if you read the Articles of Secession, they're basically adopting and embracing this view of, we as sovereign states, and by the way, we as people, because they hold special secession conventions. It's not the state governments doing this. We as the people of these states who agreed to this contract have decided the contract is hopelessly been voided by the North, and so we are going to secede. And we can do that because we're states, and this is within our purview as states. Now, this was never Madison's view, by the way. I want to make that clear as well. Madison was much closer to Jackson than he was to Calhoun. I mean, aged Madison, this is 1829 when the idea of nullification first pops up politically. Madison writes a long letter that he has published publicly saying, no, that's not what we are. And he hammers this idea, because he gets a letter from Daniel Webster saying, hey, I love your letter. We're a union, we're a nation, we're a national union. And Madison says, no, that's not what we are. Madison really leans into this idea that we are a union of the people distinguished through our state communities. That's Madison's ground of argument. But that is not universally held. It's certainly not universally held. And it's a question that is not fully resolved really until the Civil War, that the Calhoun Doctrine is finally, put to bed or done away with. It's sort of officially I think was a heretical view at the time it was created. But the Civil War amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, really put the end to this idea of the states as somehow possessing a sovereignty over the whole, right? Because it's sort of ambiguous. Okay, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of The American Founding. Next week, we are going to be taking a look at the very interesting ideas of Alexander Hamilton. I think you will enjoy that. It should be a good one. But before you go, I'll just ask that if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the podcast through your favorite streamer. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. And if you're able and wouldn't mind, please take a few seconds to review and comment on the podcast. It helps me get useful feedback and helps boost the signal of the podcast. And so with that, we're going to call it an evening. Thanks for listening and have a great week, everybody.